The cold was the first thing he felt, not the pain, not the fear, the cold. It crept into his bones as he lay face down in the snow, his rifle several feet away, his hands trembling uncontrollably. Somewhere behind him, artillery thundered again, closer this time, shaking the ground like an approaching storm. He tried to move, but his body refused to answer. Blood soaked through his uniform, dark and heavy, disappearing into the white beneath him. Minutes earlier, he had been part of a unit, surrounded by voices, orders, movement, purpose. Now there was only silence, and the unmistakable feeling that he had been left behind. Boots echoed in the distance, not friendly ones. He pressed his face deeper into the snow, slowing his breathing, forcing his body to stay still as shadows moved through the trees ahead. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but running wasn't an option. One wrong movement, one sound, and this frozen field would become his grave. He had no map, no radio, no medical supplies, just a fading heartbeat and a choice no soldier should ever have to make. Die where he was, or attempt the impossible. As the sounds of enemy patrols grew closer, he realized something chilling. The battlefield didn't care about courage, or medals, or plans. Out here, survival belonged only to those who could endure pain, silence, and fear longer than the enemy. This was no longer a war between armies. It was a war between a single, wounded man and everything around him. And according to every rule of war, every statistic, and every logical outcome, he should not have survived. But somehow, he did. World War II was not just fought on beaches, in cities, or across vast battlefields marked on maps. It was fought in silence, in forests where no one would ever know your name, in moments where survival depended not on bravery, but on endurance. The story you're about to hear was never meant to be remembered. There were no cameras, no witnesses, no heroic speeches shouted over gunfire. Just one soldier, stranded deep in enemy territory, injured, exhausted, and presumed dead by everyone who had marched beside him. Official reports would later list him as missing. Some would quietly assume he never made it out. Others would stop asking questions altogether. Because in war, disappearance is often easier to accept than the truth. But the truth is far more unsettling. Because against every expectation, against the cold, the hunger, the patrols closing in, and the slow pull of death itself, one man refused to vanish. Before we continue, take a moment to let me know where you're watching from. Whether you're listening from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or anywhere else in the world, your comment helps keep these stories alive. And if you're drawn to true wartime survival stories that reveal what history books often leave out, consider subscribing to the channel. Now, let's go back to the moment everything went wrong. The mission was never supposed to be remembered. On paper, it was routine, a short advance beyond the established line, a reconnaissance push meant to confirm enemy movement and secure a narrow corridor for a larger operation scheduled days later. No medals were expected, no headlines. Just another quiet assignment in a war filled with them. The soldier had joined his unit before dawn, the sky still heavy with clouds that pressed low against the frozen landscape. The air smelled of damp earth, metal, and something else, something sharp that lingered in every active war zone, fear perhaps, or anticipation. He didn't try to name it. They moved in a staggered line, boots crunching softly through frost-covered ground. No one spoke unless necessary. Every man knew that sound traveled farther than expected in the cold. Their lieutenant signaled a halt near the edge of a wooded area. The trees ahead formed a dense wall of shadow, their bare branches clawing at the pale morning light. Somewhere beyond them lay enemy territory, poorly mapped, inconsistently patrolled, and dangerously unpredictable. This was the first sign of trouble. Reconnaissance depended on certainty, on knowing where the enemy might be. But intelligence reports from the night before were vague, stitched together from outdated aerial photos and second-hand accounts. The terrain had shifted, roads destroyed, villages abandoned. What had once been safe routes were now potential traps. Still, orders were orders. The unit advanced. As they moved deeper, the atmosphere changed. The distant rumble of artillery faded behind them, replaced by an unsettling quiet. Even the wind seemed hesitant here, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The soldier adjusted the strap of his pack, feeling the weight dig into his shoulders. He had learned long ago that discomfort was inevitable. You ignored it, the same way you ignored the cold biting through your gloves or the ache in your legs after days without proper rest. What mattered was awareness. Every snapped twig sent his eyes scanning. Every shift of shadow drew his attention. Years of training had conditioned him to read the environment like a language. Patterns, absences, the unnatural stillness that often preceded violence. Then came the first mistake. A signal was missed. It was subtle. A hand gesture meant to pause, lost between two men as they navigated uneven ground. The line compressed, spacing narrowed. In war, that was all it took. The ambush came without warning. Gunfire erupted from the tree line ahead, sharp and sudden, ripping through the quiet like tearing fabric. The world exploded into motion, shouts, muzzle flashes, bodies diving for cover. The soldier dropped instantly, pressing himself into the frozen soil as rounds snapped overhead. Someone screamed. Orders were shouted, overlapping, impossible to distinguish. Smoke filled the air, stinging his eyes, burning his throat. He returned fire blindly toward the flashes, heart hammering so hard it drowned out everything else. Then the artillery hit. Shells slammed into the ground nearby, throwing dirt and snow high into the air. The shockwave knocked him sideways, slamming his body against the earth. For a moment the world went white. Sound vanished, replaced by a high-pitched ringing that refused to fade. When his hearing returned, it brought pain with it, a sharp, searing pain in his side. He looked down and saw blood spreading across his uniform, dark and thick, already stiffening in the cold. His fingers shook as he pressed against the wound, trying to slow the bleeding. Around him, chaos reigned. Men were pulling back, shouting names, dragging the wounded. Smoke obscured everything beyond a few feet. The line had broken. Retreat had begun. He tried to stand. His legs buckled beneath him. The soldier fell hard, breath exploding from his lungs. He reached for his rifle, fingers scraping against frozen ground. By the time he managed to pull himself upright again, the sounds of his unit were already fading. They were moving fast now, too fast to notice one man left behind. He called out, once, twice. No one answered. The forest swallowed the noise. Within minutes, the gunfire receded. Footsteps disappeared. The battle moved on without him, and as the silence settled, thick and suffocating, the realization struck with terrifying clarity. He was alone, wounded, deep in enemy territory, and the mission was over. Silence after battle is never peaceful. It presses down on you, heavy and unnatural, broken only by distant echoes that refuse to fully fade. The soldier lay where he had fallen, chest heaving, lungs burning as he tried to slow his breathing. Every inhale sent a sharp wave of pain through his side, forcing a low groan that he quickly bit back. Sound was dangerous now. He turned his head slightly, scanning through blurred vision. Smoke still drifted between the trees, thin and ghost-like, twisting through the branches. The smell of burned powder and torn earth clung to the air, refusing to leave. He was bleeding badly. That much was clear. His hands moved on instinct, pressing against the wound, fingers slick with blood that had already begun to stiffen in the cold. The fabric of his uniform was torn, edges darkened and rigid. He tried to assess the damage, but every movement sent pain shooting through his body. Training told him to move. Pain told him to stay still. He forced himself onto his elbows, teeth clenched, breath coming in short, shallow bursts. His rifle lay a few feet away, partially buried under disturbed snow. Reaching for it felt like crossing an open field under fire, but leaving it behind wasn't an option. He dragged himself forward inch by inch, every movement deliberate, slow. The forest remained silent, but that silence felt deceptive. He had learned to distrust quiet more than noise. Somewhere out there, the enemy was regrouping. When his fingers finally wrapped around the rifle's stock, relief washed through him, brief, fragile. He pulled it close, checking the chamber with trembling hands. Still functional, still loaded. Good. He needed to move before patrols arrived. Using a tree for leverage, he pushed himself upright. His vision swam, the world tilting violently as blood rushed from his head. He froze, gripping the bark, until the dizziness passed. This was when he realized something far worse than the wound. He didn't know exactly where he was. The retreat had been chaotic, direction lost, landmarks obscured by smoke and snow. The forest looked identical in every direction, endless rows of bare trees, broken only by shadows and uneven ground. He tried to recall the route they had taken in, tried to picture the map he'd studied briefly the night before, but fear had a way of erasing details, replacing them with noise and doubt. He was deep behind enemy lines. Moving blindly could mean walking straight into a patrol. Staying put meant bleeding out or being found. The choice felt impossible. He took a single step forward and nearly collapsed. His leg buckled, pain flaring white-hot through his side. He caught himself against another tree, breath ragged, heart pounding violently in his chest, footsteps faint, distant, but unmistakable. He froze. Voices followed, low, sharp, spoken in a language he understood just enough to recognize as enemy. They were close. Panic surged, threatening to override reason. He forced himself to breathe slowly, pressing his back against the tree, pulling his helmet lower over his face. The forest offered little cover, but shadows pooled thickly between the trunks. He lowered himself to the ground, inching backward, using roots and fallen branches to hide his movement. Every snapped twig felt deafening. Every shift of weight risked another surge of pain he wasn't sure he could suppress. The voices grew louder. Shapes appeared through the trees, dark figures moving methodically, rifles slung, heads turning as they scanned the area. They weren't rushing. They were hunting. He flattened himself against the cold earth, heart hammering so loudly he was certain they could hear it. Snow pressed against his cheek, numbing his skin. He didn't blink. One soldier passed so close he could see frost clinging to the fabric of his coat. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, slowly, the patrol moved on. He didn't move until the sounds were completely gone. When he finally allowed himself to breathe again, his body shook uncontrollably. Not from fear alone, but from exhaustion and blood loss. His strength was draining fast. He needed shelter, cover, something to slow the bleeding. As night crept closer, shadows lengthening between the trees, one brutal truth settled in. The ambush hadn't ended the mission. It had only begun the fight for survival. Night fell without mercy. The temperature dropped fast, dragging the last bit of warmth from his body. The forest changed once the light disappeared. Shadows thickened, sounds sharpened, and every movement felt amplified. Somewhere in the distance, artillery still rumbled, but it felt disconnected now, like another war entirely. This one was his alone. He found shelter beneath a cluster of fallen trees, their tangled trunks forming a crude barrier from the wind. It wasn't much, but it was enough to break his outline and offer a sliver of protection from passing eyes. He collapsed into the hollow, body trembling violently as exhaustion finally began to overtake adrenaline. The pain was constant now, dull and deep, pulsing with every heartbeat. He pressed his coat tighter against his side, trying to slow the bleeding, but he could feel how weak his hands had become. His fingers were stiff, clumsy, barely responding. He thought about calling out again, just once more, but the forest answered that thought with silence. Hours had passed since the ambush. If his unit had retreated safely, they were miles away by now. Even if someone realized he was missing, turning back would mean risking more lives. He knew how these decisions were made. One man, or the rest of the unit. The truth settled in slowly, heavier than fear. They weren't coming back. He wasn't angry. He wasn't surprised. Just empty. He had seen this before. Names crossed off lists, bodies never recovered, stories reduced to a single word. Missing. War didn't need closure. It moved forward whether you survived or not. His breathing became shallow as fatigue pulled at his consciousness. He fought to stay awake, slapping his numb face lightly, forcing his eyes to remain open. Sleep felt dangerous now, like something he might not return from. That was when the thoughts started. Memories surfaced uninvited, faces from home, a kitchen table, laughter that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. He pushed them away, knowing nostalgia was just another way to lose focus. Focus was survival. He checked his supplies, a half-empty canteen, a few rounds of ammunition, no medical kit, not enough. Every option seemed to lead to the same conclusion. If he stayed where he was, the cold would finish what the wound had started. If he moved, he risked patrols, collapse, or bleeding out alone in the dark. He stared up through the broken canopy, watching fragments of cloud drift past the moon. His breath fogged the air, each exhale weaker than the last. This was the moment men gave up. He felt it, the pull of surrender, the quiet temptation to close his eyes and let the forest take him. No more pain, no more fear, just stillness. But something inside him resisted, not hope, not courage, stubbornness. He had not survived training, marches, hunger, and fear to disappear quietly in the snow. If this was the end, it would not come easily. He forced himself to move. Slowly, painfully, he shifted onto his knees. His vision narrowed, black spots dancing at the edges, but he gritted his teeth and waited for the dizziness to pass. Inch by inch he crawled from the shelter, using trees to steady himself. Each step felt like dragging his body through water. He didn't know where he was going, only that staying still meant death. The forest stretched endlessly ahead, dark and indifferent. Somewhere beyond it lay either safety or capture. As he disappeared between the trees, one thing became terrifyingly clear. To the world, to his unit, to the war itself, he was already dead. But as long as he kept moving, he refused to accept it. By the time dawn began to creep through the trees, his body was no longer fully his own. Every movement felt delayed, as if his mind issued commands that his limbs struggled to obey. The wound in his side had stiffened during the night, the blood dark and crusted against the fabric of his uniform. Each step sent a sharp reminder that time was no longer on his side. The forest was waking up, birds stirred cautiously, wind whispered through the branches. Somewhere far off, a gunshot cracked the stillness, not close enough to pinpoint, but close enough to tighten his chest. He froze instantly. Sound carried farther in the morning. Patrols moved early, taking advantage of the light. He pressed himself against a tree, listening, counting heartbeats, forcing his breathing into slow, shallow rhythm. That was when he noticed the tracks. Bootprints. Fresh. They crossed the soft ground less than 20 yards ahead, moving in the same general direction he had been heading. Not rushed, organized, purposeful. They weren't sweeping randomly. They were following something. A chill ran deeper than the cold ever could. He altered his path immediately, angling downhill toward thicker brush, choosing uneven terrain that would slow anyone tracking him. Each decision took effort now. His thoughts felt heavy, dulled by pain and fatigue. Minutes passed, then more. He began to hear them. Low voices, metal shifting against fabric. the unmistakable sound of men moving with confidence. He dropped to the ground, crawling beneath fallen branches, dragging his body through mud and dead leaves. Every scrape felt deafening. His muscles burned, his vision blurred. At one point he slipped. The pain exploded through his side, tearing a sharp cry from his throat before he could stop it. Silence followed, then voices, closer now. Panic surged, hot and sudden. He pressed his face into the dirt, hands shaking as he raised his rifle. His finger hovered near the trigger, mind racing through impossible scenarios. If they saw him, there would be no escape. Footsteps approached. A shadow fell across the ground beside him. He held his breath. Seconds stretched unbearably long, then laughter. The footsteps moved past him, careless, fading slowly into the trees. They hadn't seen him, hadn't heard enough to investigate. When the danger finally passed, his body betrayed him. He vomited violently, empty stomach spasming against pain and exhaustion. His hands trembled uncontrollably as he wiped his mouth, bile burning his throat. He couldn't keep this up. Fear was draining him faster than blood. The forest no longer felt neutral. Every tree looked like a hiding enemy. Every sound felt intentional. He began to imagine movement where there was none, stopping constantly, spinning, scanning, unsure what was real anymore. Paranoia crept in quietly. He started doubting his choices, doubting his senses, doubting whether he was even moving in the right direction. North, south, it no longer mattered. All directions felt wrong. Then he saw it. A narrow dirt road, partially hidden through the trees. Enemy supply route. Dangerous, but also opportunity. Roads meant movement. Movement meant possibility, of escape, of capture, or of death. But staying in the forest meant being hunted on their terms. He watched the road for a long time. Convoys passed twice. Soldiers walked openly, relaxed, unaware of how close he was. The temptation to run across it, to break free from the forest's grip, was overwhelming. But he waited. When the road finally cleared, he moved. Crossing it took less than 10 seconds. It felt like crossing an entire lifetime. He collapsed into the trees on the other side, chest heaving, heart slamming violently against his ribs. He laughed once, a short, broken sound, then immediately stopped, terrified of the noise he'd made. That was when he understood the truth. This was no longer about reaching safety. It was about staying ahead of the moment when his body would finally give up. And somewhere behind him, whether he could hear them or not, the hunt continued. By the second night, his body had entered a dangerous state of negotiation. Every step was a discussion between will and collapse. His legs moved not because they were strong, but because stopping meant surrender. Pain had become constant, no longer sharp, no longer shocking, just a deep, consuming presence that followed every breath. The wound was infected. He could feel it. Heat radiated from his side, contrasting violently with the freezing air. His uniform clung to him, stiff with dried blood and sweat. When he pressed his fingers against the fabric, the pain pulsed outward, dull and nauseating. He no longer remembered when he had last eaten. Hunger had stopped being a sensation and had become a fog, something that slowed thought, blurred judgment, and made simple decisions feel monumental. Even lifting his rifle now required conscious effort. The forest began to thin. That alone was alarming. Open ground meant exposure. Fewer trees meant fewer shadows to disappear into. But it also meant something else, proximity to the edge of enemy-controlled territory. He didn't know how he knew. He felt it. The subtle change in movement, the spacing of patrols, the rhythm of distant activity. He slowed, crouching behind a low ridge, scanning the terrain ahead. In the distance, barely visible through the grey light, he saw it. A river. Not wide, but fast-moving. Dark water cut through the land like a wound. On the opposite bank, the trees looked different, familiar in a way he couldn't explain. The landscape felt less hostile, less watched. Crossing that river might mean freedom, or it might mean drowning. He watched it for a long time. The current was strong, swollen by melting snow upstream. Entering it wounded and weak would be dangerous. But enemy patrols avoided the water, favoring roads and higher ground. This was the kind of choice war forced on men, not between good and bad, but between terrible and worse. He waited until night. Darkness gave him cover, but it also stole depth and clarity. He crept closer to the riverbank, sliding down carefully, using roots and frozen mud to slow his descent. When he reached the edge, he hesitated. The water moved fast, loud, relentless. If he lost his footing, the current would take him. He tied what little gear he had tighter against his body and secured his rifle with a crude sling. His hands shook violently as he lowered himself into the water. The shock was immediate. Cold slammed into him like a physical blow, stealing his breath, locking his muscles. Pain exploded through his side as the icy water soaked into the wound. He bit down hard, teeth chattering uncontrollably, forcing his body forward. Step by step, he waded in. The current pushed against his legs, threatening to sweep him away. He leaned into it, planting his feet carefully, moving diagonally, never straight across. The water climbed higher, knees, thighs, waist. Halfway across, his strength faltered. His foot slipped on a submerged rock, and suddenly the river seized him. He went under, icy water filling his mouth, his nose, dragging him sideways. Panic surged as he fought to surface, arms flailing weakly. He broke through the surface, coughing violently, lungs burning. The current pulled him downstream, spinning him, slamming his body against rocks hidden beneath the surface. Pain tore through him with every impact. This was it, the moment where the impossible finally won. Somehow, his hand struck something solid, a fallen branch lodged between stones. He wrapped his fingers around it instinctively, clinging with everything he had left. The current tried to tear him free, but he held on, screaming silently as his muscles screamed in return. Slowly, painfully, he dragged himself back toward the bank. When he finally collapsed onto the far side, he lay there for a long time, unable to move. Water streamed from his clothes, pooling beneath him. His chest heaved violently as he coughed, each breath scraping his lungs raw. He had crossed, but he was breaking. His vision narrowed, the edges darkened. Sounds became distant, muffled, as if he were sinking underwater again. He rolled onto his side, pressing his face into the damp earth, grounding himself in the smell of soil and wet leaves. Stay awake, stay alive. Footsteps echoed faintly in the distance, patrols on the wrong side of the river. He forced a smile that no one could see. They wouldn't cross. The river had saved him. With the last of his strength, he crawled into the tree line, disappearing once more, but this time into ground that felt different, safer, familiar. Sometime near dawn he was found. Friendly voices, careful hands, shouts for medics. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Darkness closed in gently this time, not threatening, just heavy. When he woke days later, surrounded by canvas walls and the sterile smell of medical supplies, he learned how close he had come. Hours, they said. Maybe less. Official reports were amended. His status changed from missing to recovered. His name returned to a list. But something in him never crossed that river. Some part of him remained in the forest, cold, hunted, alone. Forever measuring life in heartbeats and footsteps, he had escaped the impossible. But the war had marked him all the same. Survival is often described as victory. But for those who live through war alone, wounded and hunted, survival comes with a cost that never appears in official reports. Long after his body healed, the memories remained. The sound of boots on frozen ground, the weight of silence pressing in from all sides, the moment he realized that, to the world, he was already dead, and that staying alive meant moving forward without certainty, without reassurance, and without witnesses. He returned home. He lived a life. But part of him never truly left that forest. War does that. It doesn't just test the body, it reshapes the mind. It teaches men that survival is not about strength or heroism, but about enduring fear longer than the moment meant to break you. His story was nearly lost to time, reduced to a line in a report, a corrected status, a name that almost disappeared. But stories like this matter, not because they glorify war, but because they reveal its truth. If this story stayed with you, consider sharing it or letting us know where you're watching from. These moments, these voices from history, only survive if they're remembered. And if you want to hear more true wartime survival stories, the ones that history books rarely tell, subscribe to the channel, because some battles don't end when the fighting stops. Some are carried for a lifetime.